Today we are blessed to have a visitor who has been around the work of the church, of the Adventist Church in the Philippines way back when, and specifically he was also involved with the pioneering work of Mountain View College. So today I have the privilege to uh, talk with Brother John Odom, and I will ask him to introduce himself because I don't know him personally. But we are going to be asking him as the background, who John Odom is, the background of his family, and of course, leading into the work that he did with Mountain View College. So, Brother John, please introduce yourself and
Okay.
tell us how young you are.
I'm 87 years old. My parents and grandparents were missionaries, and I was born 15 feet from a machine gun battery under fire during the Spanish Civil War, and my mother always said that that was the day that Johnny's missionary journey began.
Wow.
But that's another story, and we're going to concentrate on the Philippines today. My family went from Spain to Panama, and in 1940 we were called to the Philippines, but my daddy got sick and was unable to finish his work in Panama, so we were delayed coming to the Philippines. If we had come on the original schedule, we would have been guests of the Japanese at Los Baños. But
Okay.
as it was, because Daddy was sick, we did not get to the Philippines until October 8 of 1947. And I was 11 years old at the time. We were met at Pier 7, Manila, by a group of missionaries, including Mariano Nabong, who was the Philippine Publishing House truck driver.
Mhm.
And many, many years later, I was telling a mission story at the Hcbntv Adventist Church, and I mentioned Mariano Nabong, and this little lady in the back raised her hand, and I said, yes. And she said, I am Mariano Nabong's granddaughter. So it
Granddaughter.
shows that the Seventh-day Adventist work worldwide is a small one. We are all family.
Mhm.
And even though I have never met any of the current generation of Hamandres, I know your family very well.
Okay.
And I attended Philippine Union College Academy in Baisa beginning in 1949, and I completed both academy and 3 years of college work by the time I left the Philippines on June 3 of 1952.
Okay.
And
It's 5 years.
so I accomplished 6 years of education in 5 years. And during the time that I was at PUC Baisa, I was very, and always have been, very interested in astronomy. And Dr. Andrew Nelson, who was president, was also very interested in astronomy.
Mm.
And he bought the materials necessary to build a telescope for the school. And he helped me build the telescope, introduced me to people in government who were able to help me. And Dr. Nelson and I became very good friends. I did not realize at that time what a great scholar and how revered he was in the real world.
Mhm.
He instructed me when nobody else was around and it was just the two of us. He called me Johnny, and I was to call him Doc Andy. And one day, I was working at the chemistry department. I was working for Hcbntv in the stockroom. I was the dishwasher and miscellaneous laboratory assistant in the chemistry department. And I got a note brought to me by Dr. Nelson's secretary, which said, Johnny, Dr. Nelson wants to see you in his office immediately. So I left what I was doing, went to Dr. Nelson's office. He handed me a U.S. Army training manual, which was a reprint of the textbook Surveying by Breeden Hosmer, which was a standard engineering school textbook. And he said, Johnny, I want you to read this and report back to me next week. And I thought this was strange. And he said, make this your highest priority. I will make sure that somebody else does your work in the chemistry department, but study this book.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the book and I studied it. The next week I came back to Dr. Nelson's office and he said, what did you think of the book, Johnny? And I said, well, it was very interesting. I read it. I understand it. He said, could you do that kind of work? I said, I think I could, but I have no instruments. And in order to do surveying, you need proper instruments.
And how old were you then?
I was 15.
15 years old.
Yeah, I started at college there when I was 14.
Mm-hmm.
I was 15 years old. And Dr. Nelson then said, go look in the closet. So I went over to the closet in his room, in his office, and there were 2 brand new surveying instruments, a high-grade, top-of-the-line transit unit in an engineer's level, target rods for both, and a surveying chain, mm-hmm. which was basically all you needed, plus the skill. And he said, these are brand new, high-quality surveying instruments. And he said, I want you to take them and I will provide you with somebody to help you, and I want you to make a map of the college campus here in Baissa.
Okay.
So I took the instruments, I took them home, set them up, went through all the adjustments. And the next day I went to Dr. Nelson's office. I said, I will need somebody to hold the target rod and the other end of the tape if I'm going to measure the campus. He gave me the name of a student. I do not remember that name. I'm sorry. It's been a long time. And we went out and measured the campus. And I then prepared a map of the campus based on my measurements. And I came back to Dr. Nelson with my map. And I unrolled the map on his big conference table, and he set a couple things on it to weight it down. And then he went to one of his cabinets and pulled out a big map. The big map that he brought out was on blueprint paper. The one I had made was on grocery store wrapping paper. And he laid the 2 maps side by side and studied both of them very carefully. And I was thinking to myself, this is crazy. Dr. Nelson already has a map of the campus. It's stamped with a registered surveyor and a registered professional engineer, and he wants me to make a map. And the best I can do is produced here in pencil on grocery store wrapping paper. I said, this is crazy. And then he said, Johnny, we need to survey the land for our new college that we are building in Bukidnon. And I want you to go and be the instrument man and lead a party with the help of a government surveyor to survey the new property for our college in Bukidnon. I said, well, Dr. Nelson, I can't go. Doing a special job for you here on campus is one thing, but I couldn't go off to Bukidnon without my mother's permission. He said, don't worry, Johnny. I've already asked your mother, and she says you can go. And he said, we have a ticket for you from Puerto Manila to
Cebu.
Cagayan de Oro on the MV Northern Wanderer, leaving from Puerto Manila, pier whatever it was, on a given day. Get your stuff ready to go.
Hold on. Allow me to backtrack a bit.
Yeah.
Your parents accepted the call to work in the Philippines as, what were they?
Daddy
Missionaries
was
first.
editor-in-chief at the church's then only Spanish language publishing house in Canal Zone, Canal Zone, Panama.
Okay.
And the General Conference wanted him to transfer from Canal Zone,
Panama.
Canal Zone, Panama to the Philippine Publishing House, which was then in which was then in Pasay, but they were building a new plant in Baisa.
Okay.
And they wanted Daddy to take over as editor-in-chief of the new publishing plant in Baisa.
What's your dad's complete name?
Robert Leo Odom.
Okay.
Now, there is an entry in the SDA
Archives.
dictionary, encyclopedia,
Yeah. Okay.
but it's full of errors.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to correct them, but their editor insisted that I only cite published sources. My own personal memory, my mother's handwritten diaries were not acceptable sources to them. So there are many errors, but I corrected all the errors that I could.
And your
And then
mom,
I gave up.
And your mom was also serving as
My mom served as an English teacher at PUC Baisa. She worked for Irene Wakeham.
This was in the elementary or the secondary or the college
college.
level? College level.
Mother taught freshman composition. There were, I think, 4 sections of freshman composition in the college, and Mother taught 2 sections, and Miss Wakeham taught 2, and then they rearranged the schedule. But Mother and Miss Wakeham divided the work in teaching English composition and grammar.
What
And
is your
Miss
mom's?
Wakeham taught
Uh-huh.
the literature and that sort of thing, as well as the composition and grammar.
What was your mom's first name?
Her name was Martha Helen Montgomery Odom,
Okay.
and her father was Oliver Montgomery, who was the first president of the South American Division of the General Conference. He organized the South American Division,
Wow.
organized the work in South America. My mother wrote a book called Making of a Missionary, which is a biography of Grandpa. It's long since out of print, but copies come up on the internet at random. I have bought copies for as little as $5, and I know people who have paid as much as $59
Wow.
for a copy. But I only have 2 copies left with Mother's dedication, and I'm not letting them out of my hand.
And then you mentioned they served at one time for the E.G. White.
Yes. When we left the Philippines in 1952, Mother and I left in June of 1952, and Daddy came in the fall of 1952, and he was assigned as pastor evangelist in Laredo, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a district which was 400 miles long with 4 churches. And he preached 2 sermons at each church each Sabbath, one in Spanish and one in English.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he was assigned, because he was competent in both languages. And in 1954, he was transferred to the General Conference to E.G. White Publications. And when I graduated from PUC Angwin, California, in the spring of 1955, I went to visit them in Washington, D.C., where they had moved. And they continued working in Washington until well after Daddy's official retirement. He officially retired in 1968 or 69, but he kept working for them at reduced salary. You know how that works in the church. And they moved then to Arkansas, where he set up a branch office of E.G. White Publications in their garage. And he continued doing work for them there until he finally succumbed to dementia sometime in the 1980s. And in 1988, I moved them from Arkansas to Chattanooga to be near me.
Okay.
And in 1996, Daddy died, and we moved from Chattanooga to Collegedale in a house big enough to accommodate both my family and my mother in 1996. And Mother died in 1998.
Okay.
And we've been in Collegedale ever since.
So the years that they served in the Philippines was in
1947, October 8 of 1947. Mother and I left on June 3 of 1952. I don't know exactly what date Daddy left, but it was sometime in the fall of 1952.
Okay.
Because I know that he was not yet in the U.S. at Christmas time of 1952, because I was sick with malaria, a relapse from my malaria at the Philippines. And at that time, to get treated, and required my father's signature. They wouldn't accept Mother's signature, and my father was still overseas. And it was a pain. That's another whole story. But
So now you're on a boat from Manila to Cagayan de Oro.
yeah, I was afraid that and Dr. Nelson was afraid that the instruments would be stolen.
Okay.
So, because in those days the only travel, there was no ro-ros and no high-speed ferries, no fast cats, none of that. It was tramp freighters that traveled at 10 or 12 knots, less than half the speed of our current inter-island transportation. So I had a U.S. Marine Corps blanket, military blanket, and I spread that on the floor of the deck of the ship and put my luggage on the corners, and I kept the surveying instruments with me. I actually bought 2 pairs of handcuffs, and when I would sleep, I handcuffed the instruments to my wrist, because in those days in the Philippines, which was a very violent place, anything that was not bolted or welded or locked down was stolen. almost immediately. And I safely arrived in Cagayan de Oro with the instruments, with a U.S. Army duffel bag. I still have the duffel bag. It is stenciled Sergeant Leonardo Mamari. I have no idea who he is, but I still have his duffel bag.
So how long was the travel from Manila port to Cagayan de Oro?
Well, it was a couple days. We stopped at Cebu, and I went to the academy. Demetrio Echanova and his wife Fidela were principal there at the time, and I arrived on Sabbath morning during church. Academy. And with my instruments, I let them sit in their home. I felt safe there. And Fidela provided me with a wonderful Sabbath meal. Mm-hmm. And then Sunday morning, we left for Cagayan de Oro, and it was sometime Monday when I got off the ship and was met by a truck driver from the college with the then almost new international flatbed truck. And I rode to in the front seat of the truck with the instruments around my feet and back to Mountain View College. At that time that I got there, they had already built Pioneer Hall, which was about 24 feet square, 2 stories, with cogon grass thatched roof. And there was a machinery maintenance shed, which was just 4 posts and bamboo framework and cogon grass thatch. And that's where we serviced the tractors. And there was a cooking shed adjacent to Pioneer Hall where they cooked the food. And the only food that we were officially provided during the 5 weeks that I was there was rice and mung beans. There was nothing else. And of course, everybody vigorously complained about how boring the diet was. Mr. Bartlett, who got there very soon after I did, but not on the same ship, was what I call an avid vegetarian. He not only wanted his food vegetarian, but everybody else's vegetarian as well. And he would allow no non-vegetarian food on campus. And we had 2 exceptions to that occurred. One night, all the boys were complaining about and I say boys, I was the only boy there. These other people were all well into their 20s. Their education had been delayed by the war. A number of them had served with the guerrillas. They were competent young men. Mm-hmm. They were complaining about the diet, and one of them mentioned that the Lord provided quail for the
Israelites.
And the next morning, a great flock of quail came across campus. There were so many of them that you could go out there and just grab into the air and grab one. And the boys went out there and they grabbed the quail, would wring the quail's neck, drop it, and grab another one. And they picked all the quail. A quail is a very small bird, provides about 1 good bite of meat. But we had quail, and Mr. Bartlett heard about it, and he was very unhappy. and gave us all a lecture about vegetarianism. And our only question was, if this is so important, why did the Lord send us quail? And that question was never answered. The other occasion was after Tirso Hamandre Jr. arrived, which was a couple weeks after I got there. He was complaining about the food, and unlike the rest of us who either were unwilling or unable to change the situation, Tirso was always one who would find a way to change the situation. I don't know how he managed to do it, because we had to log every mile that we put on a college vehicle. But he managed to go to Bagon Taas and buy and of course he had the money to buy it. The rest of us were all flat broke with only a few centavos to our name. And he managed to buy a case of salt fish sauce. And he brought it back to campus. And we kept that hidden from Mr. Bartlett. And we would pass the bottles of fish sauce around under the table. And when he wasn't looking, we would pour some fish sauce onto our rice and mung beans and quickly turn the rice over the sauce so it was not visible. And that made life much, much easier for us, because although I don't like salted fish sauce, anything for variety from simply rice and mung beans was a help. And I then worked with a group that was assigned to us to go out and survey. And for the first part of the survey, we were around the markers of the old Crawford Ranch. And that was relatively easy because the cogon grass was so tall, we could not see from one instrument station to the next. So we built bamboo towers and mounted the surveying instrument on top of the tower and ran a plumb line down to the marker below. And then at our target, we would erect another tower, and they would hold the measuring pole at the other tower. In addition to the commercially made measuring poles that Dr. Nelson had, which the Union Conference had purchased, he had Guillermo Correces, who was a woodworking teacher at the college in Baiza. He had him make a pole extension. Mm-hmm. So we could extend the height of the pole by a given amount. Mm-hmm. And I had taken these with me to Baiza because Dr. Nelson anticipated the problem with the cogon grass. So the person on the target tower would have the extension pole, which was in two sections, about 6 feet each to make a 10-foot extension. Mm-hmm. And then the commercially made pole up above with the target numbers that we could read. And then we would have to add in our notes plus 10 feet mm-hmm. because of the extension pole.
So you were covering an area of how many hectares?
Well, we were told that it was about 1,000 hectares, but the calculations were never made while I was still there because there was a government surveyor who was there, and every time I would read the instrument, he would record the reading in his book and make notes about where we were and what we were going. Mm-hmm. And so it was his notes that were official. My notes were unofficial. I kept a logbook and I wrote down what number I read on the dial and what I called the place. but he knew the official names of the each marker on the boundary of the original Crawford Ranch. And then we went into the woods and we located survey markers out in the woods. And while we were out in the wooded area, we were not able to walk back to Pioneer Hall every night. We camped in the woods. And we had, as I said, there were 4 young men with us. And one of these, his last name was Reyna. And he was the oldest and most senior of the boys that were with me. And he had served with the guerrilla forces during the war. And he was wonderful because he knew every edible plant in the jungle. He could come up to a plant, take out his machete, slice it open, and there was good drinking water.
Water vines.
He was wonderful in that way. And, I would never have made it back if I had been out there alone. But he was, and we also constantly, he carried a whetstone in his pocket. And whenever we were stopped, whenever he was not cooking or finding food for us, he was sharpening his machete all the time. And we kidded him, why are you constantly sharpening machete? You can already shave with the machete. But he was always sharpening the machete. And after we got done with the survey and the government surveyor left, why we were building a road up what was called, what Dr. Nelson called Telescope Hill.
Yeah.
And I would mark the grade with stakes and the surveying instruments, and then I would go back away from where the work was and take the instrument with me, and either Mr. Bartlett or Job would drive the bulldozer on up and cut the actual grade of the road. And as we started up Telescope Hill, before we hit the wooded portion, it was cogon grass. And as we would dig into the cogon grass, every once in a while we would find huge boulders of granite. These were what geologists call accidentals. They were left behind by some ancient geological processes. And it was dirt around them and not bedrock. And Mr. Bartlett the dozer had 6-way power blade, which was the newest and best at that time. You didn't have to adjust the blade manually with a sledgehammer and pins. You just pulled the lever and the blade would move. And he would take the corner of the blade down under one of these big rocks, dig around it, and finally get the corner of the rock and push it up and roll it over the side, and it would roll down the mountain into the valley. And this was always quite exciting when one of these big rocks, and they were about the size of the bulldozer when he would roll them down. And that was always exciting, and a sense of accomplishment would be then. Well, Mr. Bartlett was rolling down was getting ready to roll down one of these big rocks. And in order to get it to roll down, he would have to bring the bulldozer right up to the very edge of what we had cut. And it would sort of teeter there on the edge of the road. And he rolled one of these off, and the dozer was sitting there. He pulled it back into neutral and turned over to look back to the group of us who was there, with a look of satisfaction. I did it. We got one more down. And as he looked back, there was a whole nest of cobras. 4 adult cobras, and we estimated later as many as 60 baby cobras and smashed cobra eggs were under this rock. And he looked and saw all those cobras, and he suddenly got scared. And he stepped to the track of the dozer, jumped over the cobras back to where we were, because they could easily have reached the seat, because the cobra can jump and strike 2 to 2.5 times its own length.
Wow.
And these cobras were 8 or 10 feet long. So this meant that they could jump as far as from here to well across the room and strike. And so then we were worried. Here was the dozer sitting there with no operator, and it's much easier to jump down over a nest of cobras than it would be to jump up to the nest of cobras. And just then, Reyna stepped forward, pulled his well-polished U.S. Army machete that he had been sharpening all those days. He pulled it out of its sheath and walked up fairly close to the cobras and got the sunshine off that blade and shined it into the eyes of one of the adult cobras. The cobra immediately coiled into striking position, and he played with the sun in that cobra's eyes, and just then, in a flash, he stepped aside, and as the cobra came by, he sliced the head off. Clean, perfect slice. Then he took his machete. The next adult cobra, he began teasing with the sunshine. And suddenly, the snake made a strike. He stepped aside, slashed its head off as it came by. Then with 4 dead adult cobras, about 60 baby cobras who have the full adult venom when they're babies, Job Tanamal came up, jumped up onto the track of the dozer, climbed up into the seat, backed it off from the edge onto the top of the baby cobras, pulled the levers of the dozer so that it spun around in its own length, grinding the baby cobras to mush. And then we backed off, and judging from the number of cobra heads that we were able to identify, we concluded that there were 60 or more baby cobras in this nest, which was a burrow under this big rock. And so that was one of the exciting adventures that I remember from the pioneer days. And as we started the road up Telescope Hill the last week that I was there, and on Friday of what was to be my last day, we were already into the woods, and these were beautiful, tall, straight trees that made wonderful lumber, beautiful saw logs. And Mr. Bartlett would push one tree over, and I would go ahead of him and mark the grade. And then I would pick up my instruments and come back to well behind the dozer, set the instruments down, and wait until he had partially cleared, and then I would go up and set grade for another 4 or 5 stakes. And while I was back waiting to set more grade posts, I heard a loud crack. Most of the trees, when we pushed them over, did not. Well, there was no crash until it hit the ground. But in this one, the tree was attached to another tree by vines, so it did not fall straight down. It fell over and then began to swing like a gate. And it was headed right for me. And a loud cracking noise, because of my experience in Manila, usually meant a rifle shot or a gunshot of some kind. And my experience was to hit the dirt. I had even gotten shot in my own bedroom in Baha'i from somebody's celebrating at a wedding in Baha'i. A stray bullet had come and gotten me in my own, and so I was jumpy. And when I heard this crack, I tried to hit the dirt, but I could not. I felt the hand of an angel holding my face, and I could not hit the dirt. And as the tree came swinging around, it hit me in my left knee. But just where I would have gone, there was a ditch which was dug by the broken limb of this tree, which hit the ground first. And I would have surely been killed if I had been right there. And I ended up under the tree. And the boys that were with me, they came running, and Johnny, we'll get you out. And fortunately, because of this stalb there, the trunk of the tree was not actually pressing my body. I was under it, but not crushed by it. And they grabbed me and pulled me out. And my left foot was pointing backwards. And one of the boys, whose name I do not know, do not remember, said, "Don't worry, Johnny. My father is a traditional healer, and I've seen him fix this many times." And he put his foot in my crotch, and he grabbed a hold of my foot, gave it a mighty pull, and turned it around. And whenever I've gone to a emergency room in the years since, they always ask me, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your pain level? Well, most people have no idea what a 10 is. I know what an 11 is. And for many years after that, I had trouble with this knee, and for quite a number of years, it would make an audible squeak every time I moved it. It would go squeak, squeak. People would wonder what the noise was. But I did not have my knee replaced until about 2010, because so many people I knew had bad luck with knee replacements, and they were no better off after the surgery than before. But I've had both knees replaced since. I did the left one first and then the right one. But
So how many months did it take you to finish the survey for the 1,000 hectares?
For the 1,000 hectares for the Crawford Ranch, we did that in 1 month.
1 month. Okay.
Yes, I was there for 4 weeks.
That's pretty fast.
And because we were under pressure to have land cultivated and crops planted, all of us worked 2 shifts, or actually a shift and a half. Whatever our assignment was during the daytime, at supper time, you were given another assignment of additional work to do.
So this was government regulation that you had to clear and cultivate?
Government regulations were that in order to meet the requirements that had been negotiated by your grandma, we had to have a certain amount of land planted, 2 crops. And we also had to have a certain number of the squatters paid for their property and removed to a new location. So there was one group of people, including an adult who was an administrator in a Filipino adult, who would, and the truck driver, and they would go to these squatters' places. They would negotiate and buy their property and load all their whatever they wanted to take with them into the truck and take them to new land which the government had specified. Meanwhile, after supper, we would take the bulldozer out and smash their Baha'i kubo and their little granary and start plowing the land.
So how many months was this period that the government gave?
I don't know, because I was there only 5 weeks.
Okay.
It was still going on when I left.
Okay.
The last day, the day that I hurt my knee, was to be my last day. They had passage for me back to Manila from Cagayan de Oro on that following Monday. And the boys helped me down the mountain, down Telescope Hill, and they ran cold spring water over, we had no ice, of course. We ran cold spring water over my knee then until Monday. And they helped me into the truck on Monday. And we went to Cagayan de Oro, and Mr. Bartlett was there, and with a walking stick that one of the boys made, I was able to board the ship with considerable difficulty. Of course, going back, I didn't have the instruments to worry about or anything like that. All I had was my sea bag and a blanket. And and it took me 4 days
from Cagayan to back to Manila.
Back to Manila.
Okay. So, what was very memorable to you as a pioneer clearing the land of Mountain View College?
Well, everything was. The cobras, of course, were very exciting. One night after supper, we received our assignment, and Mr. Bartlett said, "Johnny, you and Victor take the TD-14 and the plow and go to such and such a place and plow for the night." And so we got on the tractor, had a big 6-gang disc plow, and one of the memorable things was that when you were plowing at night, there was an auxiliary light mounted behind the driver's seat, which was primarily used if you had to attach or unhitch an implement or make any adjustments to the implement. But every once in a while, while plowing, we would turn it on and look back, and you would often see bits and pieces of cobra which had been cut up by the disc plow. These pieces would be wallowing there in the dirt. Anyhow, we went to this place, which was identified as the former homestead, Baha'i kubo and granary of one of the squatters that had been removed.
Mm-hmm.
And Victor knew exactly where it was, so that's why he
were
was assigned with
Okay.
me. And we went out there, and usually one person would drive from supper time to midnight, and then the other person would drive from midnight until time to go back for breakfast. And while we ate breakfast, the tractor would be serviced, and the day crew
Take over.
would use it, and I would go off to my surveying, and Victor would go off to whatever he was assigned to do. So we went off to do plowing for the night, and we got there, and I said, Victor, I don't know how I'm going to be able to do this. I am so sleepy I can hardly keep my eyes open. And he said, that's good, Johnny, because I'm not sleepy at all. I'll take the first half, you take the second half. And I said, fine, I'll sleep. So I took my blanket, and I still have the blanket, and I laid it down in a furrow because the furrows were relatively soft compared to the unplowed ground. The dirt was relatively soft. And I wrapped up in my blanket. It was cold at night in December in Bukidnon. And so you needed the blanket to keep from shivering. And I went to sleep. And sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up shivering. But I was not cold. I didn't know what was wrong. And I looked at my watch, and it was only 11 o'clock. I had another hour before I would need to take over plowing. And so I said, well, I might as well go back to sleep. So I got up and I reached down, took the corner of my blanket and shook it. And this great big fat cobra fell out of the blanket and started slinking off into the cogon grass. And then with the flashlight in my mouth, I could see at the edge of the cogon grass grains of corn, because this is where we had demolished the granary of the squatter family that had previously lived there. And wherever there's corn, there's rats. Wherever there's rats, there's snakes. And if it's Bukidnon, it's cobras. And I was scared. Had no more thought of sleep in my mind at that time. So I took my flashlight and began waving it. And pretty soon, I heard the pitch of the tractor change as the plow came out of the ground. The gears shifted. The lights flashed. Victor came charging across, and he gets there and he said, "What's wrong, Johnny? It's not your time yet. You've got another hour." And I said, "I can't sleep, Victor." And he said, "Well, that's good." He said, "because I suddenly got very sleepy." So I crawled up onto the tractor. He took my blanket, laid down in the furrow. I drove back off to the edge of the plowed area, hooked up the plow, and plowed till breakfast.
Okay, let's take a break and then we'll resume.